please raise your hand if you can't hear me. So everyone can hear me very well. So at any point in time, if you can't hear any of the speakers, please just put up your hand, okay, so that we can tune the sound system. I'm privileged to be moderating this distinguished panel. And in case I have a Freudian slip, please forgive me because my Provost is sitting in the panel. Now, in Professor Goh's presentation, he helped us to draw the common denominator between faith-based organizations as well as secular charities, and that's the power of belief. So through the power of belief, it helps to galvanize the people, it gives the mission, the unity, but at the same time, there are dangers and risks that lurk through the power of belief. And regardless whether you are a religious entity or a secular charity, there are also ways that you can mitigate the risks from the power of belief, right? So there were some of these measures that he introduced, including managing diversity, whistleblowing, and so on and so forth. So we're going to go in depth through this panel discussion. So while the questions are rolling in, what I'd like to do is I'd like to first pose the first question to Lam Sang, and then we'll move on to Robson. But essentially what I'd like to hear from Lam Sang first is his motivation for getting involved in board governance. What are your motivations? And then we'll move on to Robson.
I think I was invited to join Care Corner. I didn't know very much about Care Corner before I joined, but by a colleague in my company who actually introduced me to the organization. And of course, I took time to consider, but I felt that I have been experienced in working with boards when I was in senior management. And then I had also been fortunate to be appointed to boards after that. Several boards, including listed boards abroad and here in Singapore. So I felt that I do have some experience and exposure to the area of board operation and board governance to contribute. So, and I thought that it is a way of giving back. So I really did not think very long before I said yes. So I joined the board 10 years ago in 2013, and I've been serving on it, seeing the organization evolve, and especially in the area of governance. And I was glad that I could contribute because of my own exposure and personal experience in this area. And I really appreciate the opportunity to serve and to contribute there.
Thank you, Lam Sang. Robson, how did you get involved in board governance?
Well, governance is an area of my practice, my legal practice. I've sat on 6-7 listed companies over the course of 20 years. During my practice as a lawyer, I've also served on charities, education. I was on the board of Hwa Chong, serving there about 20 odd years. My last 3 years was chairman of the, the principal holding company. I relinquished that just before COVID. I'm still on the board of Eaton House Foundation. It's a charity arm of Eaton House. And I was just sharing with someone that I used to be on the board of the Buddha Tooth Relic Temple. It's not really religious, but yet it's driven by religious principles because it's classified as a cultural organization. I'm currently serving on SIAS, which is an IPC, for 10 over years. And I've also served in various capacities over a number of years as a legal advisor of various non-profit organizations, helping out in their governance, internal controls, and risk management. What motivates me? I think the availability of myself to contribute to the governance of the particular organization and seeing improvements. I think that's the greatest satisfaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Robson. Yeah, I'd now like to move on to Theresa, our Chair of Charity Council. Would you like to contribute to that question before we get the ball rolling?
Okay, sure. I started my governance journey more than 25 years ago when I started my own company, and of course we had to comply to the Companies Act. And soon after, my company got affiliated with a global group, which I became the co-chair of that group. So then I have to understand the US law as well with regards to governance. But more importantly, I want to emphasize when I get into the charity sector 15 years ago, I was invited to be a volunteer for NVPC to help them to conceive the board match program. At that point in time, I had no idea what the charity sector is, nor about the governance in the sector. But I found out one thing. If you do well as a volunteer for this sector, you get sucked into many other roles. So I was a volunteer for 6 months. 6 months later, I became a board member. 1 year later, I became the vice chair, and a few months later, I became the chair of what I started, which is the Center for Nonprofit Leadership. So then the journey for governance becomes very, very steep. And after doing well for CNPL, I hope, I got invited to other boards, non-profit boards, CLGs, as well as state boards. And I do realize that the entire theme around governance is the same across sectors. It's really about the extent to which the organization conforms, as well as the extent to which the organization performs. So of course, governance, corporate governance or charity governance to me is about achieving the highest level of both conformance and performance. And in my current role, of course, what we try to do is to ensure that there's a good balance between conformance and performance, and also to be very clear about the differences in the profiles of the charities. Every sector will have your own nuances. Your size, your stage of your life cycle, these are all very, very different from each other, and the extent to which you apply a single policy is something that we have to be very sensitive about. And of course, it takes two to clap. We set the rules, we set the policies, we set the enablers, and we expect a response as well. It takes two to clap, and of course, that is what governance is all about.
Thank you, Theresa. It's board governance at a macro level.
Yes.
Thank you. Prof Goh?
Same question, how I got started in serving, I'm a sucker for all those issues that the strengths of the faith-based organizations that I talked about. They all sort of apply to me. And I can't imagine serving for very long. I get bored easily. Sorry, no pun intended, but I cannot serve on a board for long because I'll be the most board member if I don't have a belief. Right? And it applies to the two IPCs that I served on with. I've always been involved in church leadership and church governance, but also in the Metropolitan YMCA, which has a diversified range of charities and services. But also in terms of my work and my research, which is on Christian organizations, and my work as well, which is why I'm here now with SUSS, entirely because of its social mission, which is a kind of belief system, a value system that I can subscribe to, and which keeps me going, basically.
And it is this power of belief that can sometimes make us trip and fall over, right? So let's now turn to the most popular question from the audience. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty with the tablet, so I won't be able to show it on the screen. Yeah, but I can see it on my iPad. So I'll be reading out from the pigeonhole. So the first question will be the one that has the most votes from everyone. So for those of you who have not seen the pigeonhole, just scan the QR code, enter your question. I'll be taking from there. Okay, so the first one, how do we balance the need for accountability versus trust, especially in a religious organization or charity context, right, where the power of belief binds, where more reporting or rules may be considered as distrusting? Chair Lady, would you like to start this off?
All right. Well, firstly, we all have to recognize that our form of governance is guided by comply or explain, right? And of course, if you can't comply, you will have to explain. And the way you explain it has to be credible. And this question says that where more reporting or rules may be considered as distrusting, I don't quite get it here unless you are insinuating that some of the reporting are actually not the reflection of the truth. Yes, and we, as the regulator office and the secretariat, we have enough experience to suss out. If you can't comply and you explain, we can suss out from the narrative how much is real and how much is not. Yeah, and of course, if it's real, definitely we will understand your situation. And what we look forward to is a plan to get towards partial compliance and then another plan to get into full compliance. Yeah, so we're not waiting for you to explain every year why you can't comply. We have to see a progressive intention towards compliance, right? So I would say that's accountability. It is your responsibility to understand the policies and the rules and the regulation, and also to calibrate among yourselves, among board members and management, where you are on this spectrum of compliance. Yeah? And that builds trust, of course. I mentioned earlier on that the Code of Governance is not just for charities, it's also for the public. It's also for your employees. It's for your donors as well. I believe there will come a time when we would have promoted the Code of Governance to all segments of society, and everyone would be kind of calibrating your level of governance on a single standard. And I think that's where we start to move towards a common trust, building common expectations of charitable organizations. And this applies to whether you are a religious organization or not.
Thank you. Robson, can we hear from you?
Well, I don't see accountability and trust as distinct concepts. In fact, trust comes with integrity, accountability, and basic honesty. Trust should not be misplaced, as in, you give absolute reverence to a particular founder or religious head, to the extent that you just simply bury your head in the sand when common sense tells you that something is not right. So it's important that someone who is in the organization as a stakeholder or as a member of the management committee to look and be aware that there are certain responsibilities attached to the position of management committee or board or what have you, and that there should be certain rules, certain norms, and there is a proverbial balance that has to be struck between religiosity and secularism, and how do you strike that dynamic balance? I think this is an answer that has to be addressed not as a one-size-fits-all, but also within the context and cultural beliefs and tenets of faith of that particular organization. I think this is where the MCCY or the Charity Council has to exercise some form of oversight in respect of the people who sit on the management committee, so that they can be entrusted to do the right thing. over and above the religious context in which the organization was founded.
Thank you, Robson. Yep. Lamsa?
If I may be allowed to refer to the question where it says that especially in a religious organization or charity context where more reporting or rules may be considered as distrusting. I think more reporting or rules doesn't mean that we are being distrusted to do the work. I think on the other hand, more reporting and disclosures may generate more trust. So therefore, I don't see that as needing to balance. To me, I think as a charity organization, we need to disclose our mission, our vision, our intent, our plans, our finances, accurate reporting, so that trust may be generated. So it should lead to more trust rather than we become suspicious of this attempt to ask for more reporting. I think the more we can disclose, the more trust will be generated.
Thanks for that. So the balance is between conformance and performance to generate the currency of trust. Right? Can we hear from you, Prof Goh?
Okay, I'm trying to imagine a scenario where this question comes up, right? So maybe you're the leader of a faith-based organization and you put in place good governance rules, including on reporting, etc., conflict of interest issues. And then somebody says, it sounds as though you don't trust us. What are all these rules for, right? So based on personal experience, this is a sort of, I hope this is a helpful tip, right? My answer to this will always be, oh, this doesn't apply to people like you of high integrity. It is something to catch the people of low integrity, somebody else out there who may not have the same kind of high moral standards as you, basically. If you have those high moral standards, and especially in faith-based organizations, you can adapt that by saying, if you believe, and you really subscribe to the moral code of your religion, these rules are actually low-hanging fruit. Right? You should actually have a greater degree of compliance, integrity, honesty based on your religious principles than these rules. So these rules don't actually show mistrust. They're actually there to catch a kind of the lower performance, lower hanging fruit, which should not apply to the majority of employees. So that's usually how I spin the thing here.
Thanks. On this note, let's move on to our next question. And it's related to this idea of a spiritual leader that Prof Goh mentioned in his speech. So before I ask the next highest voted question, just a general question to tap on the wisdom from the panelists here. Could you share your experience in calling out a spiritual leader in a charity organization? Anyone?
I guess we have to develop a clear and comprehensive policies as well as procedures and that clearly define how an individual can report concerns and then to ensure confidentiality and protection from retaliation. So I think this is the very basic. I mean, I won't call it is ironclad, but it is a basic that all organizations must adopt, where clear rules are made known to all stakeholders that there is this policy and there is whistleblower protection and that there is the will to investigate. So I think this is the thing that I think we must take note of.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I wouldn't call it calling out.
Okay.
I would call it as gentle reminders that there are certain norms, certain rules of conduct. Because sometimes the religious leader or the religious leaders are very immersed in their faith and their ingrained practices that they may not draw a distinct line about what is the right thing to do, what's the legal thing to do in terms of transparency, in terms of, for example, having proper internal controls and risk management to regulate, for example, interested persons' transactions, or some form of favoritism. Or he's a member of our fellowship or our organization, so we should give him preferential treatment in certain contracting jobs, for example. I think this is where you got to highlight that there are certain procedures and processes so that you can withstand scrutiny. And you do it in a very amicable, frank, candid discussion, so that at the end of the day, people appreciate why certain things have to be done in a certain way. That's what I've gone through.
Thank you. Theresa?
Same as Robson, I would not use the word calling out, but it's equally important. I'm advisor to a faith-based organization that looks after schools, community service in Singapore, as well as missions abroad. Having spent a lot of time with the leadership team, I actually believe that their brains are wired differently. Yeah, after 30, 40, 50 years of meditation and reflection, and being in the spiritual realm, I do believe that biologically they are a little bit different from us, which means if we push them structure, technical terms, the law, it's going to be very hard for them to swallow. And at the same time, it's going to disrupt their state of peace and tranquility. Yeah, so as an advisor to them, I would go to the highest level and say, form yourself a board, a council, a governing council of sorts that has the different diversity, skills, experiences, and personalities, and even motivation. Now, even that took a while because they are thinking, do we want to have to go into meetings and be challenged because we are supposed to be peacemakers and live harmoniously? Well, with patience and love and compassion, which is exactly what they believe in, they begin to see that, yes, they really do have to live with diversity and learn how to maximize that diversity through the virtues that they practice. And when you get to that state, I think they begin to see for themselves how rich the experience, the different genders, and even the different ways of thinking about things can actually enrich their own spiritual quotient. Yeah, so I would say that is a form of calling out with a lot of love and patience and single-mindedness, yeah, to ensure that they really do implement that diversity on the board. And once that happens, it cascades downwards.
Thank you. Prof Goh, would you like to add your perspective?
So I agree with my co-panelists, and I think I would call that a productive environment. It works in a productive environment, right? The trouble, I think, is that there are some situations which go so far below or beyond productive, and I think that's where the spirit of the question comes from, right? When we haven't done all those things that we're talking about, to have proper governance, to have diversity of perspectives and all that, where the board is appointed by the spiritual leader, because the board will actually assent to what the spiritual leader wants. And the spiritual leader is surrounded by basically a yes culture. That's very, very difficult. So calling out, I think, is relevant to that situation and not the kind of healthy and productive situations that my co-panelists talk about. Yeah, for calling out somebody in an unproductive and unhealthy situation, a spiritual leader in that kind of situation, it really takes guts, I have to admit. It's outright whistleblowing, it's going to the media. It really takes that kind of it's like throwing yourself in front of a juggernaut, a runaway train or runaway car. So the key takeaway, I guess, is don't let this organization get to that stage. Because once it gets to that stage, it's horrendous, right? You should really put in the checkpoints before it gets that bad. And then it becomes that kind of productive reminders that Robson says, and Theresa says, reminders or gentle sorts of dialogues with the spiritual leader.
Okay, I'd like to take a checkpoint now to realign our discussion. So when we talk about religious organizations, faith-based organizations, we typically refer to the moral code, right? Can I draw a parallel between the moral code and organization culture in secular charity. And if the parallel can be drawn, what we talked about in terms of spiritual leader, in terms of setting the perimeters, the policies and the procedures around governing our behaviors and setting the guardrails, that applies to whether it is a faith-based charity or a secular charity. Right, okay, we are aligned, very good. So this next question pertains to the term limit. Okay, and let me ask the question. The Code of Governance mandates maximum board terms. However, in faith-based charities, the founder or head of religious body is key in directing the direction of the board. How can this opposing needs be met? And I would say that this can apply whether it is a religious charity or a secular charity. Yeah, so it can apply in both situations. Can we have Theresa answer this question first?
Okay, I'm looking at the statement and it says that, however, in faith-based charities, the founder is key in directing the direction of the board. I challenge that premise itself in the sense that you are referring to one person. Yeah, a founder is one person, or head of religious body is one person. And you know, just having this one person provide the direction, the accountability standards, the transparency, is that realistic? And it's exactly what Robbie said in his slide earlier, that you have a spiritual director that creates an invisible, universal mandate, where whatever he says goes unquestioned. Now, that is a high-risk situation, yeah? Assuming this person is on the right path. And to me, I do believe that the road to hell is paved with a lot of good intentions. All of us are human beings. We have what we call, I call it concupiscence, which is somehow the tendency to give in to temptations. Yeah, none of us is divine in that sense. So we will make errors, we make human judgments, and it's the same for this founder or the religious leader. This person shouldn't be infallible in that sense, otherwise this person is not human, right? So that basic statement alone must be challenged, right? And if that statement is challenged, it means the responsibility for governance falls on the board or the council. It's shared by many people, right? And with diversity, there is check and balance. Yeah, there is challenge and support that leads the religious organization to a good level of governance. So I do not think these opposing needs, I don't think these are opposing needs. It is opposing only if the starting premise is not correct. And that's where I challenge that premise.
Thank you, Theresa. Yeah, Robson, I know you want to jump in.
I think, you know, you can strike a dynamic balance. And to borrow an analogy, in companies, for example, the CEO does not need to be a member of the board. The board can be an independent group of people who does not need to be the head of the religious body, for example. But that's where you have to be very careful, because you don't want a situation where board members are appointed with the influence of the religious head, because then that's where he perpetuates or he uses the board as a rubber stamp. You know, putting aside his ability to read the religious body, the board must be primarily focused on the rules, the proper conduct, and the way things should be done in a transparent, and you have all these things like accountability, integrity of management, etc., etc. So you can strike that balance, but you have to be careful that it's not a situation whereby the board is appointed with the blessing of the religious head, because then that's where the danger is and mischief could potentially arise. So you don't have to worry about the founder or the head of the religious body having served his maximum term or limit and say, oh my God, my time is up. No. You can have a separate body nominated by an independent nominating committee and appointed by members who are stakeholders of the body and the organization in an AGM once every 2 years or thereabouts. That way you can have a balance between accountability, guardrails in accordance with the code of governance. At the same time, you do not have a situation where the religious head suddenly disappears because his time limit is up. You can't find a replacement so easily.
Thank you. Answer?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the Constitution says and how the board operates. Now, the founder or the head is just one person. If the person has a strong view, it's the duty of the board to reflect and to their views, their other views, unless the board is fully in support of the views of the founder and religious leader. So I think the board plays a very important part to make sure that there is proper debate for all the ideas and propositions put forward by the founder or religious leader. He or she is just one person. So unless the board is beholden to the religious leader or founder and doesn't speak up or doesn't put forward its own independent views, then of course a lot of trouble will come about. But hopefully the board is independently minded as well as responsible in providing the balancing mechanism needed to make sure that decisions made at the board level is sound and evidence-based.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next question. And this is about the dangers and risks that was highlighted in Professor Goh's presentation. This is a question: could it be argued that any organization could fall into the danger categories of good name syndrome, spiritual leader, and invincible universal mission? And maybe what I'd like our panelists to expand on this question is, from your experience, how did you manage some of these risks through your role as a board director previously? Maybe Prof Goh, you could start.
As I suggested in my presentation, yes, any organization that relies on a certain degree of what we might call universal, supernatural principles, is in danger of all these sorts of things. Any charismatic leader that appeals to the environment, for example, to take a non-religious cause, charismatic enough, influential enough, impassioned, convicted enough to build a body of committed followers, you will see the same sorts of potential problems, right? So it's anything that can appeal to that kind of supernatural, universal mission. However, I think that many organizations can't do that. And if many of you are also in positions leading secular organizations, you know how difficult it is. For me, in the education universities context, there is, to a certain extent, a universal mission, which is education, right? But there are a lot of KPIs and a lot of material factors associated with that mission. And if you fail those material KPIs, for example, your institution's research is no good, or the fundraising is no good, or the quality of teaching, the feedback of the teaching, the hires are no good, there's a very easy sort of material check on the leadership. You're not a good leader because you're not fulfilling those sorts of material KPIs. It's the organizations where those material, so the crux of the matter is whether those material KPIs, which for us are the foundation of good governance, evidence governance, that makes complete sense to all of us, is there a situation where these things can get elided or hidden under universalizing spiritual, supernatural rhetoric and logic? That's the situation where a lot of the dangers happen. If the answer is no, that the material KPIs, the material evidence is just too important, too central to the organization, then you're not going to be in danger of this. Yeah? But in any organization, religious or quasi-religious, yeah, or just a strong belief-based organization, the answer is yes, that in fact, a lot of the KPIs, the material evidence doesn't matter because of that kind of overpowering charisma of the leader or the universal principles of the cause, then you are always going to be in danger, whether it's an explicitly religious organization or an implicitly belief-based organization.
Thank you. So clearly the risks and dangers it can be experienced by all organizations. So maybe Theresa can expand on what were some of the measures and experience that you have implemented to manage these dangers and risks.
Okay. So to me, a good name syndrome, if you use it in a non-religious term, it just means organizational ego that has flipped to the hubris side, which means you protect the organizational reputation regardless of whether you're telling the truth or not. Yeah? And spiritual leader, there are red flags. Yeah? Look out for dominant leaders, unreasonable leaders, and charismatic leaders. I believe that all of us are equipped with a radar within us to recognize whether a leader is a good one or not a good one. Yeah? But with that spirituality and that religion that can blind us. Yeah? And of course, if we start to become aware of the goodness of governance, I think those blind spots can slowly go away. And the invisible universal mission, I would call it groupthink at the highest level. You know, everyone in the board and the management are thinking alike. Right, so there are different measures. Of course, the whistleblowing is one of them. Yeah, if we believe that a leader is not acting in a decent manner, go the whistleblowing route. Yeah, and of course, this is assuming that you have a policy in place, that the policy safeguards the whistleblower. Yeah, and the people that you whistleblow to are people who are going to take action on it. Yeah, so the whistleblowing policy now becomes very, very central to ensuring that the board is not just independent, but also transparent. And with groupthink, Robson mentioned about the independent process of appointing board members. So that's very important. If you have a nominating committee, it is important for the chair to be independent. It's also important for the chair not to be the chair of the board, right? And if you have a committee, it is important that at least half of the committee members are independent, right? So independence is key to ensuring that we do not have something skewing to one particular board member or to the chair. The other thing I want to talk about is this thing called devil's advocate, right? Which it's a big thing if you talk about religious organizations, because you call the devil and it's not a good thing. But in the leadership world, a devil's advocate just means that the board deliberately appoints somebody to call out the board for the sake of calling out. Right? Somebody who is brave enough to say, hey, perhaps we should look at things in another way, right? Perhaps we are having too many of us saying the same thing, right? So a devil's advocate is one proven example of how you can diffuse groupthink.
Well, I wouldn't call the board devil's advocate. I will call it the audit committee, or to basically remind or to highlight certain things which may not withstand scrutiny, which may not be in compliance. No religion, as far as I know, teach you not to be honest, or to steal, or to do bad things. Or to do things that deceive people, make misuse of donations and funds. Any religious leader worth his salt or her salt would not condone such actions. I think that must be the guiding principle. And then, of course, that spiritual leader can say, look, I want to devote myself in the spiritual aspects of the organization in praying, in leading people to the divine, you know. And I'll leave this things like governance, compliance to lay people, lay persons who will serve as members of the audit committee to highlight or to raise a flag if some things are just not done in the best way. I think that's where you can strike that equilibrium between someone who is a religious leader, revered and respected for his ability to guide, to teach, and at the same time to be fully in compliance and not to rely on the so-called good name syndrome, because the minute you have done something wrong or an egregious manner has happened on anyone's watch, whether is it the spiritual leader or the members of the board, the good names syndrome can spiral down to the abyss of disrepute. And I don't think any person would want that to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Robson. Lamsam?
As the saying goes, paper cannot keep fire for too long. So I think the board must be vigilant to all these syndromes. So the board being closest to the organization and its operation must be the one who be the first to put forward its objection, put forward its concerns within the board meeting. So I think in this day of internet, where conversations can be recorded and posted, I think the board must be vigilant to make sure that we deal with the problem internally before it gets out into the open, and then it becomes beyond control, and our reputation will be ruined. Yeah.
Thank you for that. The next question relates to conflict of interest and what Robson said earlier about audit committee, in particular, having non-religious leaders feel as the members of audit committee will be very useful. But I'd like to pose this question to the panel as well. Besides the audit committee, how else can we circumvent this risk? So let me read this question. It says, in faith-based entities, the bonds of friendship and community can go deep across. This can lead to many potential and perceived conflict of interest situations. So how to manage that effectively? So we spoke earlier about having audit committee and having secular members fill the committee to audit the organization. But what other measures can there be to mitigate such risks?
Can I just take on, follow up?
Yeah, please.
I think it's important that the board must be independently appointed. That's why I suggested that we should have an independent nominating committee that is, basically process-driven. So you invite respectable people in various fields, accountants, lawyers, people who are in other charities, to then look at candidates who have been proposed and to interview them if necessary, and that the religious leader doesn't have a say in the persons nominated, and have then that group of persons who have been approved by the nominating committee or nominated by the nominating committee to be appointed by the members of the organization. And I think it's important here that you can't have a board of old school friends, the old boys network, that you are my friend, therefore you rub my back, you cover me, and all that kind of stuff. I think it goes into the way, the ethos of the organization, how it works, how it's governed. So if you have all these processes in place, then I think you can mitigate the risk of having bonds of friendship and community to override or to basically serve as a camouflage of something that might be more nefarious than what it appears to be.
Thank you. Prof Goh, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I agree completely with Robson, and let me just amplify what he talked about in terms of ethos. Let's go beyond the governance into the ethos, right? I think you have to build a culture where everybody is there for a common reason, not because of friendship, and it goes beyond friendship. it devolves upon the leadership to recall to everybody periodically the reason why we're serving. And it has to be bigger than the social bonds, bigger than the friendship, right? If people say I'm here because I want to see so-and-so, it's a good time to catch up with my friends and all that, I will question that person's fitness to serve in the leadership of the organization, because they've lost sight of the real purpose of the organization. So a kind of health check on the part of the leadership is very, very important. And another very concrete way to do this, I used to practice this a lot, is I would suggest somebody to, as a member for the board, that didn't necessarily get along, that didn't come from the same background. There's a little bit off-center, a little bit out of left field, right? And I propose this to the board members and see what they say. And if they had reasons against the appointment that sort of revolve around social reasons, I will again say, no, that's not a good reason. We're going to bring that person in, because we need that kind of diversity of views, right? But if the reasons were, okay, this person is going to be bad for the board because of integrity issues or conflict of interest issues, then that's a good health check, because it means that the board members are thinking in the right kind of way rather than the kind of social and community kind of ways as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that by reminding everyone that the entire organization, from board all the way down to the lowest level in the organization, everybody is responsible for governance. Yeah, the difference is that the board is held accountable for it. Yeah, and sometimes the board arrow it to the CEO, right? But it's important to know that at every level of the organization, we are responsible for governance, meaning we have to conform as well as perform. I do see friendship as falling on the performance side, the culture of cohesiveness, of good relationships, of supporting each other, and that's good, yeah, because it's important for building the bonding capital. Now, at every level of the organization, you should also understand the conformance angle of it, yeah, which is the compliance to professional standards, the compliance to the law of the land, and also fulfilling the day-to-day activities that adds up to the accountability and transparency quotient of your board members. Yeah, so if everybody thinks this way, I think we will reach a good balance, yeah, of conformance and performance in the whole organization. And as far as culture is concerned, we are always led by a suite of values. Right, you want to ensure this suite of values is encompassing both conformance and performance. Yeah, so we have a lot of values that say trust, respect, maybe friendship, fun. That's a good thing. But on the other side, it's important as well to have honesty, integrity, responsibility, which is the conformance side of the values. So if you have a set of balanced values that drives the culture of the organization, and that gets translated into tangible practices, I'm sure you are on a way to a well-governed organization where everybody takes responsibility, not just the board and management, but yes, they are held accountable if anything goes wrong.
Thank you. Lamsa, would you like to add your perspective too?
To add very simply that this is where the nominations committee can play a huge role. Nominations committee must examine the composition of the board and how to promote more diversity. In other words, don't allow too many board members to come from the same school or the same church or the same denomination, things like that. Or not too many members are introduced by one person, especially the chairperson. So I think in that way, we have a board that comes from a diverse background. Not everyone has the same thick bond or relationship with the leader. And then we are in a better position to manage any conflict of interest situation.
Thank you. Let's now move on to ESG matters, ESG and board governance. And there is this question with reference to ESG values. And let me read the question first, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit for the panelists. So with reference to ESG values, there are values in the ESG that a religious organization doesn't subscribe to, is it possible to not adopt those? Right, so maybe to hear from the panelists, what are some of these ESG values and how might charities, religious and secular, go about implementing ESG practices? Okay, anyone first? How about maybe Robson, would you like to chime in?
Well, I think ESG is an aspiration, you know, because, for example, certain religious organizations, they burn offerings, you know, in certain month of the year. So, you know, where is the environmental part? I think that's very sensitive and tricky. So I think it's important to get the governance right first. And then in order to be part of the social framework, you have to be accountable, you have to be transparent, you got to comply, you got to be seen above board. Things are done in a very, things are done with integrity. Then you talk about the environment part, because I think that part is a bit tricky, because you don't have a single common standard, and who is to audit them in terms of ESG compliance, for example. So these things are still evolving, but it's good to have it as an aspiration, as a targeted set of goals, but I think it has to evolve gradually within each and every organization. You can't have something that says that tomorrow you have to comply by this. This is the commencement date of a particular law or rule, for example. That's my view.
Thank you, Robson. Theresa?
Right, so the Charity Council, we're in the process of creating a ESG guideline. Yeah, so that's, of course, we are going to be pretty comprehensive and yet not prescriptive, because we will understand the nuances of, say, certain sectors and also the religious. But I wanted to go back to Robson's example. I would like to differentiate between values and practices. Yeah, if you do have an ESG value that says you don't protect the environment, then I would urge all of you to question that value. But if in protecting the environment you cannot carry out certain rituals and practices, that's fine, you can go with that, but overall, in your overall quotient of practices, it should lean towards saving the environment. Yeah, one or two practices that differ, nobody's going to hold you accountable in that sense. We're not that unreasonable. But now you do have to differentiate. Values and practices are two separate things. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And which also means that we need to interpret it in the context of the organization. Right? Every charity organization would have different values, and they would interpret the ESG practices, the policies accordingly. So it's contextualized to the organization. Thank you. Lamsa, would you like to add to that as a board chair?
Just that, I mean, ESG is still very new, I mean, among the charity side, although on the corporate side, they have already advanced it a bit further. But I think like all things, there's time to study and understand what are the essentials. So as long as our organization is trying our best to implement measures that will contribute to the ESG goals and values, I think we can progress along the way. What we find acceptable today, over time we may find that we have to change. So I am more optimistic than that. It's not a question of want to adopt or don't want to adopt. I think we all want to adopt ESG values. If our organization finds it difficult to adopt some of these now, there is a bit of time for us to adapt and then to learn from other places how they manage this kind of issues, like whether to burn incense or not to burn incense. You know, I'm sure other countries are facing these kind of issues. So I think let us progress together in this one, in terms of adoption of ESG values.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes to wrap up the discussion. And in the final 2 minutes, what I'd like to hear from the panelists is any advice you would give to anyone who is preparing to volunteer to serve in the charity board. Right, so we've been giving advice, the panelists has been giving advice on board governance, but there may be some of you who are considering serving in a charity board. So let's hear from the panelists any advice, maybe just one advice to give to anyone who's considering serving and volunteering on a charity board. We could start with Prof Goh.
You mean faith-based organizations or not?
Secular.
Okay. I would say look for dysfunction. If you see signs of dysfunction, turn the opposite direction and run away, seriously, because once the rot sets in, it's very, very hard to, as I said, you're stuck in this situation of dramatic whistleblowing and then, a battle in social media and name calling and those sorts of things. So you have to have those there may be one or two things not quite in place yet, that's okay, but really serious structural dysfunction, if you see it, turn around, walk away, look for it. There are lots of other organizations that will need your help, actually.
The charity sector is really a very, very, very diverse one. Yeah. So the nugget that I would like to leave you with is actually borrowed from one of my favorite authors, who is St. Augustine of Hippo. And he says that with regards to diversity, in all things that are essential, we must have clarity. In all things that are non-essential, we can have liberality. And in all things, we must have charity.
Thank you.
Well, I think you got to understand. Well, that's a very good one. You must fully understand your roles and responsibilities. What is expected of you? You have to read, understand the code of governance, for example, the bylaws and constitutional provisions, the unspoken conventions. Fully understand what you are getting into, and whether can you fully and properly discharge your role as a member of the committee or board of governors before you agree to take on, because you have responsibilities. And if things go wrong, you can't duck it, because you got to face the music. If things happen, it become Ori on your watch. So you must understand what you are in for.
Thank you.
I think my advice would be to be prepared to be independent. I think be vigilant. You are going there to contribute. You are not going there to be a yes man. So exercise your independence and give your feedback and your point of view to be considered by the whole board. Thank you.
I'm reluctant to draw this panel discussion to a close. There's so much wealth of wisdom from the panelists, and I urge you to approach them, to engage them in discussion during the break time. So with this, please join me to thank our panelists for their inputs and their contributions in the panel discussion. Thank you very much.